Hi, and welcome back to our APES Flipped Classroom, where we resume our journey by talking about aquatic and terrestrial pollutants. We've just finished up our unit on atmospheric pollutants. And so today we're going to start by talking about sources of pollutants and then talking about specific pollutants and how we address them. So first thing we're going to do is classify into point versus non-point pollutant sources. And we've done some of this already with atmospheric pollution. Remember that a point source is a pollutant that enters the environment from an easily identified, confined space. You can point to a point source. So these effluent pipes are a great example of a point source. A non-point source is when the pollutants enter the environment from many different places at once, so it's difficult to point to any one individual source or even one area. So an example of that would be this sediment pollution that we can see in this image of this estuary, and you can see all of the sediment, but it's coming from lots of different places, sort of everywhere all at once. So when we think about point sources, we talk about aquatic pollution. We could be talking about animal waste runoff from a concentrated animal feeding operation or a CAFO. This would add things like ammonia or other nitrogen sources, fecal coliform bacteria, which can transmit diseases. If we go back to our atmospheric pollution, this would be things like emissions from the smokestack of a coal power plant. So things like carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide, or particulate matter. Or this could be an oil spill, like the BP oil spill that adds hydrocarbons and benzene to the water, but it's coming from one particular point source. When we talk about non-point sources, these are typically things like urban runoff, all of those impermeable surfaces in the city where we have the runoff of motor oil, of nitrate, fertilizers, of road salt, of sediment. So that's a non-point source because there's all those roads and parking lots. We also have farming is considered a non-point source. Unlike a CAFO, where you have a lagoon or an area where that animal waste is supposed to be contained, the fields are non-point sources. So whether we're talking about pesticides that are being sprayed and being carried by the wind, or whether we're talking about fertilizer that is running off and washing into bodies of water. So farming is considered non-point, but CAFOs are considered point. So it is a fine distinction, but one you need to make. Estuaries, as we see in the picture here, and other bays are polluted by lots of non-point pollution sources from the large watersheds that empty into them. And you might remember when we went on our boat trip in the fall that we talked about the sediment pollution that is very prevalent in the Chesapeake Bay, and it's considered non-point pollution, and it's because there's such a huge watershed that leads into the Chesapeake Bay. We talked about this in atmospheric pollution. I'm going to keep emphasizing it. There's a difference between pollutants and pollution. And so pollutants are specific chemicals or groups of chemicals from specific sources with very specific environmental and human health effects. When we talk about pollutants, we're likely to earn credit on the FRQ. But pollution is just a vague, nondescript term. It's any substance that's harmful to the environment, and this is never going to be acceptable on an APES FRQ, with 3 exceptions that we're going to talk about. Okay, so yes to pollutants, no to pollution. Any pollution-related FRQ, you want to make sure you name a specific pollutant. You want to name the source of that pollutant, its environmental and its human effects, and the strategies that are used to mitigate it. Now remember, read the question, answer the question. Don't give information that's not asked for, but be specific, don't be vague. Okay, so name a pollutant, talk about nitrogen oxide, not air pollution. Talk about sediment, not water pollution. Now, when we talk about pollution, the 3 exceptions that are allowed for you to use the term pollution would be these 3 specific categories of pollution. Thermal pollution, where water is being warmed, usually by a power plant, frequently by a nuclear power plant. Noise pollution, where we're talking about noise that harms the animals in the environment or humans in the environment, or sediment pollution, where we're talking about sediment washing into a body of water. So those are the 3 times that I'm going to allow you to use the word pollution, but I do not want to see air pollution, water pollution, land pollution. Okay, we've got to be more specific than that and name a pollutant. Okay, so I want you to pause the video and go ahead and do this practice FRQ, where I want you to describe, not identify, but describe the difference between a point and a non-point source of pollution. And I want you to identify one point source of nitrogen oxide emissions and one non-point source of nitrogen oxide emissions. And then you'll unpause and we'll talk about human impacts on ecosystems. We're going to talk about range of tolerance. We're going to talk about coral reefs. And we're going to talk about oil spills. So let's start with range of tolerance. We've talked about this already back in unit 2, maybe, or 3, when we talked about the range of tolerance of organisms. So this should feel like review. We know that organisms have a range of tolerance for the abiotic conditions in their habitats. Abiotic conditions are things like pH, temperature, salinity, sunlight, nutrient levels. But they also have a range of tolerance for pollutants that human activities release into their habitats. And sometimes the human activities can impact those other abiotic conditions, pH, temperature, salinity, nutrient levels, even sunlight. But when we talk about the pollutants, they cause physiological stress. That physiological stress might be limited growth. It might be limiting their reproductive function. It might be causing them difficulty with respiration or breathing, or in extreme cases, even potentially asphyxiation or suffocation. A lot of pollutants are endocrine or hormonal disruptors. And in extreme cases, the concentration of pollutant is high enough, it can actually cause death. Be careful with this one. A lot of the time when you answer FRQs, if you jump immediately to death, then we haven't proven that we are far enough outside of the range of tolerance that could be a result. So be specific. A big theme of this unit is being able to explain the specific effects of pollutants on organisms. So you wouldn't want to say that nitrogen oxides cause damage to reproductive functions, because they don't. Nitrogen oxides cause difficulty with respiration. They cause difficulty with the mucosal membranes. They cause irritation to the eyes, but they don't cause difficulty with reproduction. So you want to make sure that you understand the specific effect of each pollutant on organisms. So let's jump into acid rain, because that's one of the ones that has very specific effects and is very specific to range of tolerance. So our different aquatic species have different pH tolerances. Most organisms prefer to stay in a range that is from very slightly basic to very slightly acidic. And when we get outside of that range, then we start to see physiological stress, and too far outside of that range, and we get into killing off populations. So as the pH decreases, remember, pH decreasing means that it's becoming more acidic. It goes outside of the optimal range for a species, and the population is going to start to decline. And when the pH gets totally outside of the range of tolerance, they can't survive at all. That might be because of aluminum toxicity, because you remember that as pH decreases, aluminum becomes more soluble, and so aluminum levels go up. That's toxic to most organisms. Or this could be because it interferes with the sodium pumps of the cells, and so it disrupts the osmolarity of the blood. Remember, within the range of tolerance, the center of that range is the area where they thrive, and at the edges is where they can just survive, but not necessarily thrive. So a lot of our aquatic species are what we call indicator species. And again, you might remember those from one of our early units. So our indicator species can be used to determine the conditions of an ecosystem. And specifically here, we're talking about the conditions of the water. So as an example, white moss and filamentous algae indicates that the pH is below 6. So those actually like the really acidic conditions, and as the pH decreases, their population increases. But other populations die off as the pH decreases. So our crustaceans and mollusks tend to die off below a pH of 6. And so if we have a high crustacean population, then we know we're close to neutral, a pH above 6. Low or no crustacean populations means that it's below 6. And some of our sensitive insects, our plants, our zooplankton, and this fish called a roach actually die at about 5.5. And some of the larger fish species are more tolerant, being able to survive all the way down to a pH of 4.5, but not surviving very well below that. So we can use species to tell us about the health of the environment. Reef algae, you might remember from our unit when we talked about ocean warming and ocean acidification, have a very specific temperature tolerance. So remember that the coral reef is a mutualistic relationship between the coral and these photosynthetic algae called zooxanthellae. The algae supply sugar to the coral, and the coral supply carbon dioxide and organic material to the zooxanthellae. Because the algae have a narrow temperature tolerance, when the temperature gets too high, the algae start to leave, the corals get stressed, the corals kick the algae out, and the corals lose their color, they become stressed, they become vulnerable to disease without their main food source of the algae. So temperature is one of the things that can cause the algae to leave the reef, but also other pollutants, sediment, pesticides, even some chemicals from sunscreens can also force the algae to leave the reef. Other human impacts on coral reefs. We disrupt these coral reef ecosystems because of the warming caused by greenhouse gas emissions, but we also overfish, which decreases fish populations in coral reef ecosystems. And bottom trawling can break up the reef structure and stir up sediment. A lot of reef organisms are caught as bycatch in commercial fishing operations and are unable to reestablish. And then finally, our urban and our agricultural runoff also damage coral reef ecosystems, whether that's through sediment pollution that makes the water more turbid, preventing sunlight from penetrating, which makes hunting more difficult, and also impedes photosynthesis of those coral reef algae, those zooxanthellae. Also toxicants, so those toxic chemicals, chemicals in sunscreen, oil from roadways, pesticides from agricultural runoff, those also cause the death of the algae, which are the basis of the food chain there. And then finally, nutrients. We can have ammonia from animal waste, nitrates or phosphates from fertilizers, whether that's agricultural, people putting them on their lawns, or even golf courses. All of that runoff that leads to those algal blooms, which then result in overuse of the nutrients and the die-offs, and then the subsequent dead zones from the decomposition, using up all the oxygen in the water. So lots of different ways that we impact coral reefs. Okay, oil spills. These are probably one of the first things that comes to mind when you start to think about aquatic pollution. And so when hydrocarbons in crude oil or petroleum get into the water, they're toxic to many marine organisms. They can kill them, particularly if they eat them, ingest them, or even if they absorb them through their gills or through their skin. If the concentrations aren't high enough to kill them, there are other physiological effects as well. It decreases visibility, making it difficult for predators to hunt. It decreases the photosynthesis because of less sunlight penetrating the water surface. The oil itself can stick to birds' feathers, which makes them not waterproof and makes them unable to fly. Also, the oil can sink to the bottom and kill bottom dwellers due to either direct toxicity or to suffocation of those bottom dwellers. Oil also washes ashore, which has an impact on tourism, as well as on marine fisheries because it kills fish, which decreases fishing revenue and decreases the number of fish available to seafood restaurants. Finally, oil also settles into the root structures of the estuary habitats like mangroves or salt marshes. It can be toxic to those salt marsh grasses. It kills them, it loosens the root structure. By loosening the root structure, it then leads to erosion of the coastline. And those root structures are very often the habitats that are used by fish and by shellfish for their breeding grounds. And so it has an impact on the ability of organisms to reproduce. So how do we clean it up? So these spills can occur when we have an underwater oil well that explodes or blows out, like the Gulf of Mexico spill, the BP Deep Horizon oil spill, or when a tanker runs into something, runs aground, runs into a rock, runs into an iceberg, and is punctured. So the Exxon Valdez in 1988, I think, is an example of that one. So what are the tools that we use? Cleanup, one of the primary initial tools is booms. So booms are long floating barriers that are used to contain the spread. And then usually something else will come along, either a skimmer or a ship with vacuum tubes to siphon the oil off the surface. Physical removal of the oil once it reaches the shore. This can be using towels, soap, shovels to clean up sand, rocks, and of course, all of the organisms that are on the shoreline as well. And then chemical dispersants are often sprayed on oil slicks. They break up, that's what dispersant means. They break up the oil slick and cause the particles to sink to the bottom. This clears up the surface, but it can actually smother the bottom dwellers, and the dispersant chemicals themselves can be harmful to the ecosystem. You will also see burning of the oil on the surface. This is in situ burning, meaning on-site burning. And what this does is it actually burns, combusts the oil so that it is no longer in the water, which has the advantage of taking it out of the water, but has the disadvantage of adding all of those atmospheric pollutants, the carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides of that combustion process. One other method that is used is there are some genetically modified bacteria that can actually consume hydrocarbons, and so those will sometimes also be sprayed on the surface in order to try and eliminate the oil spill. Okay, so your second practice FRQ prompt is asking you to look at the technically recoverable oil resource of ANWR, or the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge. How much is there? How much we use in the United States every day? And I want you to determine how many days of oil are available if we were to totally recover all of the oil in that ANWR resource. Okay. And as always, I look forward to hearing your questions and seeing you in class.